Well, my name is Evan. I'm one of the senior pastors, and I'm grateful that you came out on this icy morning to be with us in person, and I'm grateful for those watching online that you've tuned in to be with us today as we continue our journey through the Gospel of Mark. Before we get to Mark, I want to read a couple scriptures to set us up this morning for this talk. John 14:8. Philip, one of the disciples, said to Jesus, "Lord, show us the Father, and we will be satisfied." Jesus replied, "Have I been with you all this time, Philip? And yet you still don't know who I am? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father." And 2 Corinthians 4:6, "For it is the God who commanded light to shine out of darkness, who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ." In the face of Jesus Christ. I'm not a big worrier. I sleep pretty well at night, but there are some very key things that I worry about as I lead alongside Ben pastoring this church. And I think for me, one of the greatest worries I have is that years down the road, we together will have experienced something that will have presented a distorted view of who God is. Now, this worries me. There are things like, church growth and the success of our ministries and more people coming alongside. All that is wonderful. I don't worry about it. I trust God in those things. But what I do worry about is that somehow we will spend all these years together, and at the end of it, we will walk away with a vision of who God is that misses the mark. That we will somehow have an impression that God is hateful or distant or disappointed or demanding, that he is angry or upset or having a bad day when it comes to you. I worry that we will somehow get the wrong image of what God looks like. And if you want to know why we spend so much time walking through the Gospels, we've been doing this now, I think this is our third year. We did Luke and then Matthew and now Mark, where we spend the first quarter of the whole year walking through a gospel. Why do we spend so much time talking through the narrative of the story, the life of Jesus? It's because if we get a picture of who Jesus is, we get a picture of who God is. And in Jesus, we have a perfect image of who God is. And why this is important is because something that I read from Brendan Manning, he said, the Christian faith is not about religious performance, but about recognizing the face of God in Jesus. That the whole of our journey of faith, the entirety of what we're trying to do is to see Jesus and recognize him as what we worship. I don't want us to get the wrong impression about who God is. This made me think of something, and I can't make this stuff up. This happened on Friday. We were at the car wash vacuuming out our car, Alyssa and I. And evidently at some point while we were vacuuming, my wallet fell out of my pocket onto the ground. And so we left, and I don't realize until we get home that my wallet is gone. I'm like, I bet I dropped it. And so I got back in the car, and I drove back to the car wash. And by the time I'd gotten back, there was a woman in her car, and she was parked right where we were parked, vacuuming out her car. And so I waited for a moment, and I'll just go ask her if I can look around the area for my wallet. And so I get out of my car, and I'm probably 15 feet away. I'm not super close, about 15 feet away from her. And she's vacuuming, and I say, "Excuse me." And she looks up at me startled, and she pauses. She looks me up and down, and then she throws her legs into her front seat, and she slams the door. And we're making eye contact. I'm like, oh, she's frightened by me, right? I'm an imposing, very strong man, so I understand this. It's sad that that's such a laugh line. It's really sad. But I had this, I remembered this, that I heard an author once say. He said, there's a subconscious way when you're meeting people for the first time to put them at ease, and it's very subconscious, but you show them that you're not holding anything because it signals like, I don't have any weapons, I'm not hiding anything. And so I thought of this really quickly, and so I'm looking at her, and I'm like, okay, I should smile and show her that I'm not holding anything, so I go, kid you not, she locks the door. I hear it. So now I have to yell because the window's up, and I'm like, can I look under your car? She's like, I'm going to leave. I said, that's probably a good idea. So she just left. And I realized I do not have the kind of face that puts people at ease. I'm okay with this. I'm going to embrace this. This is what I think is so critical when we think about who Jesus is that the face of Jesus says something about God, and it should stir in us a certain kind of response. Hopefully not the response of this woman at the car wash. But that if we were to see Jesus' face, his countenance towards us, if we were to see that, it would change everything. Change everything about how we view God and how we believe that God views us. If we could see the face of Jesus, it would communicate something about God's compassion and his care and his kindness for you. Okay, Mark chapter 5.
Did you find the wallet?
I did find my wallet. It was there. It was right under her car. Thank you for asking. Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 21. Jesus got into the boat again, and he went back to the other side of the lake where a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. And then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. And when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. My little daughter is dying, he said. Please come and lay your hands on her and heal her so that she can live. And Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. And so imagine this, this is a local leader. So, it's important. This is an important person in this little community that Jesus is in. And they've all surrounded him. The whole crowd is going with him to see what Jesus is going to do to show up and hopefully heal this little girl who is sick and dying. It's a very important moment. Jesus is on a mission, right? Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she had spent everything she had to pay them, but she had gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. She had heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd. Notice that she comes up from behind him, and she touched his robe, for she thought to herself in verse 28, if I can just touch his robe, I will be healed. And immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him, and he turned around in the crowd and he asked, who touched my robe? And his disciples said to him, look at this crowd pressing around you. How can you ask, who touched me? He's like, because I'm Jesus. I can ask whatever I want. But he kept on looking around to see who had done it. And then the frightened woman, trembling, she's shaking at the realization of what had happened to her, came and she fell on her knees in front of him, and she told him what she had done. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over. This is a story within a story. This is something that John Mark, the writer of this gospel, loves to do. He has these little mechanisms in how he's writing this account. And so within the greater story of Jesus going to heal this important leader's daughter, and the center of that story is a much more quiet and intimate moment where Jesus, who is far too busy and far too important and far too caught up in important things to stop and pause, does just that. That when this woman who has had this chronic condition, this hemorrhaging that she has spent all of her money trying to solve, she's desperate. When she comes to Jesus with just a little bit of faith and the hope that if she could just not be a bother, right? I'm not going to interrupt him. I'm not going to stop him. I don't want to get in the way. I don't want the attention. But if I could just come up behind him and if I could just touch some of his clothing, I believe. I have faith that I'd be healed. I think often of this story and how, have you ever had something delivered to your house, like Uber Eats or Instacart or something, and you don't want to talk to the delivery driver, right? You just say, leave it at the door, and then you wait in the shadows for the delivery to be done, and then as soon as they pull away, then you scurry like a rat, and you grab your stuff, and you come back inside. This is just me. Okay. I know we do this. And I always think like, okay, if I make eye contact, do I have to tip more afterwards? Like do it, because there's this unspoken thing where it's like, if you check, leave it at the door, we're not going to have a conversation, right? This is going to be a purely transactional thing where I pay through the app and then you give me my groceries. That's how it's going to be. And I get the sense with this woman that she doesn't want to bother anybody. She doesn't want the exposure of her condition. If she went to Jesus, she'd have to explain what's going on in front of everybody. And for this community and this culture, so many religious ritual laws that say in her condition, she shouldn't even be in public. She should be at home. And so the very nature of her out among the people means that she's breaking the law. And so in her shame of this condition, and it's no fault of her own, but that's not how everyone treats it. She comes to quietly and hopefully passively in a way that no one will notice. She hopes to get free from her suffering. And Jesus will have none of this transactional engagement. He will have none of this one-sided, just take from me what you need and I won't even notice. He will have none of it. And so in the busyness of his moment where he's rushing to get to Jairus, his daughter, he stops everything. He doesn't just stop, but he turns around to find this woman. And she's shaking. She's terrified. And after 12 years with this ailment, with this condition, in their culture and context, surely this would have happened before where she would have been exposed as breaking the rules in public places, where she would have just had to go out and try to survive and find a way to get through it, even with such an ailment. And I'm certain that this would not be the first time when she was caught in the middle of a crowd and told to go home and to stop breaking the rules and to get with the program. And certainly she would have been expecting this from Jesus, this important rabbi, that he would scold her, that he would condemn her, that he would tell her to go back where she belongs. But he's so kind. He's so kind to her that as she's there kneeling, trembling, he turns to her and face to face, he utters a word, and the first word out of Jesus' mouth is not a word of condemnation, accusation, or disappointment. He says the word, daughter. And with that one word, he is inviting her back in to the community that she had been excommunicated from. He is saying a word that has this implication of family connection to him. Whereas Jesus is saying, hey, if I belong here, you belong here because you're with me. And with one word, he utters his approval, and more than that he is pleased with her faith. Wow. To everyone's shock, this law-breaking woman receives the pleasure and the approval of Jesus. I just wonder how oftentimes we make these assumptions about how God feels about us. That we assume that to be face to face with God's presence and his holiness would automatically make us on the wrong side of God's day, right? That somehow if we were to get too close into God's presence and if we were to see his face, his reaction to us, that it would be a reaction of condemnation and accusation. That certainly, because I know my shortcomings in my life and my character and my habits, certainly God would be upset with me. And we live, I think, oftentimes our whole lives and our whole faith journey is all about just trying to keep enough distance to where God doesn't fully get to express his displeasure with how we are and what we do. And can I tell you that if we could only see his face, we would know he's so pleased with us. He's so happy that we've come. He's so happy that we're close. And what could possibly, in our condition, in our state, and all the things we've done wrong, and all the ways that we haven't measured up to this perfection that certainly God cares about, what could make him happy with us? I'll tell you what. Hebrews 11:6, it's impossible to please God without faith, and anyone who wants to come to him must believe that God exists, and he rewards those who sincerely seek him. Do you know what makes God pleased with us? It's not when your performance is perfect. It's not when you finally achieve this status where you no longer sin, you no longer make mistakes. What pleases God, according to Hebrews 11, is when you come to him in faith. Just like a desperate woman who came up behind Jesus just to get her miracle and be on her way. But it's that little bit of faith that Jesus responds to. And I think this is the offer for us. You know, in the Old Testament, oftentimes when God would be displeased with the people of Israel, the metaphor that would be used was that he was turning his face away from them. They would get into all kinds of trouble and they would worship these idols and they would turn away from God. And so God, in response to it, said he would turn his face away from them. And in fact, David in Psalms 27, he prays this prayer. He says, don't hide your face from me. Don't turn away from me in anger. So the turning away, the face being turned from someone, that is a sign of displeasure and anger and disapproval. And the opposite is true, that when God turns his face towards us, it is a sign not only that he is considering us or giving us attention, but that he is pleased with us. And I think this is so hard because oftentimes I can wrap my hands and my heart and my head around this idea that I'm accepted by God, that I'm forgiven by him, that for my sins and my mistakes, that somehow God has made a way through the cross and through sending his son Jesus, that I can be forgiven of those sins. I can wrap my head around that. But you know what's really hard to believe sometimes is that God likes me. Yeah. To really believe not only that God has forgiven me, not only that Jesus is accepting me as a son, but to believe this, that God is not annoyed with me, he is not too busy for me, but that Jesus is turning around to express his pleasure that I am close. This is hard to believe sometimes. And if we can't wrestle with this, if we never get to the point where we ask the question, can God possibly not just love me, not just accept me, but be pleased with me? I think we will live Christian lives that are half full and half engaged because we'll always be wondering if God is disgusted and annoyed and too busy for us. But here's the story from Mark chapter 5 today, is that he turns around towards us. And that the little bit of faith we come to him with is all it takes to be on God's good side. And when we come to him, there's three things I want to point out that Jesus does and is. Number one, Jesus doesn't compare your troubles to anyone else's. Jesus wasn't in that moment saying, well, we've got a 12-year-old girl who's dying, and we have a woman here who has got a chronic condition that's been that way for a long time, so clearly it's more important for me to spend my time over here. Jesus doesn't engage in any of that kind of calculus. And oftentimes I think we feel like because other people are experiencing something more difficult than us, that we probably shouldn't bother God with that prayer or that desire. That somebody else's world is much more deserving of that kind of attention from God. Listen, God doesn't compare our troubles with anyone else's. When we come to him in faith, he responds to our needs. And you might be experiencing something today where you feel like it's real, but it's not that big of a deal. Come on, we bring it before Jesus. I believe he's so kind. And he doesn't compare. Number two, Jesus' first word to you is one of belonging. I don't want you to get the wrong impression about God, that somehow in his holiness he's become so distant. The entire point of the New Testament, of the gospel, the story of Jesus, is that a distant God that was so far above us came down to be close. That is the whole point. And because of that, what God wasn't saying to people in the Old Testament, now Jesus says to them in the New Testament, daughter, your faith has made you whole. Son, you've been far from me, but now you're close because of my mercy and my kindness to you. And number 3, Jesus is so pleased with you. I was going to qualify that. I wrote that down this morning. Jesus is so pleased with you. And then I was going to qualify it and be like, this is the conditions that you meet for Jesus to be pleased with you. And I thought, no, that's exactly what the religious leaders around Jesus were doing all the time. They were setting up the rules and the way and the path in order to get God's approval and for him to be happy with you. It was always conditioned. And I just felt so strongly, even this morning as I was writing those words, Jesus is so pleased with you. I just felt even the voice of God just saying, don't qualify it. Anyone who has ears to hear that, anyone who has a need to receive that, anyone who can receive that today is for them. I'm pleased with them. Full stop. And if that feels scandalous because you know the state of your life or how much you screw up or your doubts and what you wrestle with, that is the kind of scandal that Jesus was all about. He was upsetting every expectation of what it takes to make God happy with humanity. He was upsetting it constantly. And if today you have this need in your soul to know that you are someone who brings Jesus great joy, I just felt so strongly this is for you. And if you're offended because of your doctrine and your religious viewpoint on what it takes to actually please God, that's fine. That line is not for you today. But for you that need it, you feel this baseline disappointment from God, can I just take that off of you today and say, Jesus is so pleased with your faith. There's this really ancient prayer out of Numbers chapter 6 that Moses shared with the people of Israel way back in the desert. And to this day, Jewish communities and Catholic communities and Anglicans and Lutherans and the odd Protestant like us pray this prayer. Out of Numbers chapter 6:24, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. Last week we talked about finding peace in the storm when life rages. And I tell you what, there is another kind of storm, and it's when you feel that God is not accepting of you or that he's angry at you. And I think it's wonderful when God brings peace to the storms of our circumstances, but the great gift of the coming of Jesus is that he brought peace between us and God. That this prayer that the people had been praying for centuries has found its full completion in the person of Jesus. That now, because Jesus is among us, the Lord has made his face to shine on us. And he is gracious to us, that he has turned his face towards us, and he's given us peace. I want to do this. If you bow your heads with me, I want to invite us into a space where we ask that we would realize and recognize and say yes to the willingness of Jesus to turn his face towards us, to express not only does he forgive sins, not only does he accept us as sons and daughters, but today he is pleased with us. He sees your faith, and he's responding with his kindness and his healing. God's not mad at you. God's not frustrated with you. The psalm says he knows what we are. He knows we're dust, but he's gracious and compassionate. And so this morning in this space together, we sit in the We sit in the approval of Jesus today. And Lord Jesus, I pray that as we, in this moment, just respond to the smile of God, that we would unburden and take off of our shoulder those things that we have carried around, those pieces of shame or humiliation, those pieces of religious guilt that we have worn like a heavy burden. Lord, today would we be able to take those off and lay those at the foot of the cross. And as we turn towards you, would we find that you've already turned your face towards us? That we might look and see, when we look into your face, that you're so pleased. You're so happy we're here. I just encourage you in the quietness of this moment, just release your burdens to Jesus and just hear it loud and clear today. He is pleased with you. He loves you. He's happy with you. Lord Jesus, we thank you for your kindness, your goodness, and we thank you for the way that you reveal the true nature of the Father. In Jesus' name, amen.